All right, I will say good morning, and let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Haba Adin Lotova, Oshi and Mindy Schreiber, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in the schos of Refuah Shlema for Elio Rafael ben Miriam, and Mati Chanalei Margalit, in memory of Mati's father, Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel ben Yekusu Yehuda, whose yahrzeit is on Chaf Dalid Teves. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah should have together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu should Meretz Hashem shower Bersoros Tovos upon Klav Yisrael. And with that, let us begin with a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Yud 110. We are picking up on Kuf Tes Amud Beis 109b, and let's just pick up from Amar Rabbah, even though we went to just a few lines below that. So Amar Rabbah is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lines up from the bottom. We actually got a little bit further than that, but let's just pick up here. Amar Rabbah, so remember again, we're discussing the interesting topic over here in the Mishnah was, the overarching topic that we've been dealing with already for the last little while is the concept of offering up karbanos or sacrificial items outside of the Beis HaMikdash and the liability that one incurs in doing so. The first stage of that conversation focused on animal sacrifice. The second stage now is transition in this last Mishnah to non-animal offerings, komets, levona, ketores, minchas kohanim, so on and so forth. The shaila just is, how much of those items do you have to offer outside of the Beis HaMikdash in order to incur liability? So the Tanna Kama said that as long as you go ahead, once you offer up a kizayis, ultimately there's liability. Rabbi Lazar said that you are pater until you offer up the entire amount. All right, so that's the first part of this machlokes. So we'll say, so here we're talking about this idea regarding ketores. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbah, Baktar dehechal dekoli amalo pligi. Everyone agrees that when it comes to the Haktorah, when it comes to the ketores offered up inside of the Beis HaMikdash, everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, there is no biblical shear, and the shear that is given ultimately is rabbinic. Keep pligi, where's the machlokes? Baktar dipnim, with the ketores of Yom Kippur, that's given inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The Mar Savar, because we'll say there, the Torah does say, how much does the kohen offer up? Melo chafnav. Now, melo chafnav literally means 2 handfuls. So the Mar Savar, melo chafnav dafka. One says melo chafnav is a shear, right? And therefore, we'll say, remember again, if the Torah gives a shear, that means that that's the amount obviously the Torah wants you to offer. And if you were to offer less than that amount outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there would not be liability. Because remember, again, I will say the way it works is, when is there liability? There's liability when a parallel sacrifice done inside would be accepted. But if the parallel inside sacrifice would not be valid, then halacha l'maisa there's not liability. So the Gemara says this: Savar melo chafnav dafka, umar savar melo chafnav lav dafka. That's the machlokes. The machlokes is melo chafnav. Is that terminology of 2 handfuls? Is that dafka? Is that literally a precise shear that the Torah is telling us that we are obligated to bring, or not? Abaye, the hakiksiva chuka baktar de pnimu. 1 second. How can you say that melo chafnav is not an explicit and necessary shear? After all, the Torah uses the word chuka. Chuka means an everlasting statute. Everlasting statute means this is what the Torah tells you you have to do. So again, melo chafnav is not a suggestion, but rather it would seem to be the obligation. To which the Gemara says, Allah amra Abaye, Baktara bifnim kuli amalo pligi. Rather, Abaye says like this: when it comes to the offering of the ketores inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, i.e. of Yom Kippur, everyone agrees that you require a shear. And what's the shear? Below chafnav 2 handfuls. Ki pligi. What's the machlokes? Baktar de chutz, where ultimately again the ketores of chutz means of the Beis HaMikdash, not chutz outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but ultimately again ketores that's offered up every day, daily ketores that's offered up on the golden mizbeach in the heichal. Mar savar yalfinan pnim michutz. One opinion says that we learn out pnim michutz We learn out Yom Kippur from the daily offering. Just like the daily offering doesn't have an explicit share, so to the daily one, so to Yom Kippur doesn't. Umar Savar Lo Yalpi. Another opinion says, no, we don't learn that out. Okay, Amar Rava, Hashta, that doesn't make any sense, because Hashta, Chutz Lo Yalpi, Rabbanan, P'nim Michutz Mibai. We don't even learn out what we call Chutz Michutz. We don't learn out what we'll call other heichal offerings. From other heichal offerings, you're going to learn out chutz pnim mechutz. What are you talking about? Mahi, what are you referring to? Disanya. We learned in a brayso. Yochol hamala pachos mikizayis chometz upachos mikizayis emurin. I might have thought like this. I might have thought that one who offers up less than a kizayis of a chometz, right, or less than a kizayis of emurin, which are sacrificial parts, or hamenasech pachos mishloshes lugin yayin, or one who offers up less than 3 lug of wine, or pachos migimel lugin mayim, or less than 3 lug of water, yehei chayiv. I would have thought that such a person would be chayiv. Talmud lomar, I will say 4 lines up from the bottom, 109b. Talmud lomar la'asos. Therefore, the pasuk says, "You shall perform al hashalim chayiv ve'eno chayiv ala chaser." So we'll say this is an important rule. Right, so we'll say, and this is actually a rule mentioned in our Mishnah as well. When is there liability ultimately for shchutei chutz? When is there liability? There's liability when you perform the carbon in its complete fashion. But if you perform it in a deficient fashion, then there's not going to be liability. V'ha pachos, but here's the issue. V'ha pachos mishloshes lugin, de'ispu kamazesim, yet Rabbi say, interestingly enough, let's say again a wine libation. A wine libation is normally made up of 3 lugin. Contained within 3 lugin are multiple kizesim. Now, remember again, a lug is a liquid measure, a kizais is usually a dry measure. But again, conceptually, there are many kizesim within a lug, within 3 lugin. And yet, what do you see from here? That halacha l'maisa, the only time there's liability for offering up a wine libation outside of the Beis HaMikdash is if you do all 3 lugin. So what do you see from here? V'lo yalpi rabbanan chutz michutz, and the rabbanan are not learning out chutz michutz, as opposed to, let's say, other sacrificial items where, let's say, for example, let's say by Ketores, where if you did offer up a kizayis, that would be enough. Yet Rabbana are not learning out one case from the other. Amarava, Rava says, what's the case? Kigon, this is actually very interesting. Tikav inu shnei chatzoi pras bimana. Supposed to listen to this. What's the case? The case over here is as follows. The case is where, look at Rashi for just a moment. Amarava kigon tekavinu b'mana li'olam masnisinu braysa b'haktara dehechal havya haktara b'duchta b'kizayis v'achi katani b'braysa chayiv Rabbi Lazar moda kidrapa. Sorry, let me just say this outside. So the idea of Rabbi say is where you took 2 half measures of breast and put them in the same kli. So in other words, they're not combined, but they're in the same utensil. So the top of Kuf Yud 110a, Mar Savar Kvius Mana Milsehi. One opinion says that 2 half measures in a kli combines them. Even though they're not actually mixed together, the fact that they are situated in the same kli, that actually unites them as one. Umar says, Mar Savar Kvius Mana Milsehi, Umar Savar Lav Milsehi. The other opinion says, no, a full measure only becomes a measure when it's mixed together. But if there's 2 half measures sitting in the same kli, the kli does not unite them into one comprehensive measure. Amar Rava says, Hashta, l'manda amar kvi usa demana v'lo klumhu, according to the opinion that says that a utensil does not go ahead and make everything into one comprehensive measure. Listen to this. Kava shisha lepar. Listen to this. Let's say you had 6 lugin. You had 6 lugin ultimately set aside as a wine libation for a par offering. Okay, and then what did you do? Umashach mehen arba'a. You took 4 of those lugin outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Vekrivan b'chutz. And then you went ahead and you offered them up outside of the Beis HaMikdash. What's the halacha? Chayiv. You chayiv. Now, why you chayiv? Now, we just said before that in general, if you offer up partial measures outside that you're not liable, why would you be liable in this case? Shiru'uyin la'ayil. Because again, as much as you need 6 lugin for a nesach, for a libation, for a par, you only need 4 for an ayil. So therefore, if you had 6 designated for a par, you took 4 of them and offered them outside for an ayil, ultimately there would be liability because you performed a proper, complete libational service. Similarly, kava arba la'ayil, if you went ahead and you set aside 4 lugin for an ayol, umashach mehen shlosha, and you took 3 of those lugin outside, vekrivan bachos, and you offer them outside, chayiv, it would be chayiv as well. Why? Shiru'uyin lekeves, because ultimately, again, that is suitable for a sheep offering. So we'll say, so you see what's happening over here? As much as we were saying before, that in order to incur liability for doing things bachutz, you have to perform the service in its entirety. The Gemara is just giving you an interesting twist on this. That let's say if you set aside 6 lugin of wine for a libation for a par, and you took 4 of those and you offer it up outside, you would be liable. Why? Because 4 is proper for an ayol, for a ram offering. Similarly, if you set aside 4 and you took 3 outside and offered them up, as much as that looks like it's deficient, it's not, because it's a complete libational offering for a keves. However, if you only had 3 and you went ahead and you took less than 3 out and offered that up outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you would be pater. Why? Because there is no such thing as a libational offering less than 3 lugin. So I want to point out what's happening over here, and we're going to talk about this more in greater depth in the Rambam in just a moment. What's happening over here is as follows. The Gemara is creating a rule. The rule is that the only time that there is liability for offering up what we'll call a karban bachutz, offering up some type of either a karban sacrificial matter, consecrated items, is when you are performing a complete service. But if the service is incomplete, then there is no liability. Now, the chiddush over here is the service could be complete, in a different way than you had intended. But as long as it represents a complete unit of service, ultimately there's going to be liability. Incredible. Rashi says, Nisuch mehaktara lo yalfi Rabbanan. The Rabbanan do not learn out the concept of nisuch. Nisuch refers to wine or water libations from haktara, from burning. Afagav duchutz michutz lo yalfi, haktara mehaktara yalfi. Even though, again, Rashi says, Nisuch mehaktara lo yalfi Rabbanan. So Rabbanan do not learn out nisuch from haktara. Afagav duchutz michutz, even though it changes it over here. Even though ultimately, again, even though these are both even though these are both things that happen outside, right? In other words, not in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Haktara mehaktara yalfi, but we do learn out one case of haktara from another case of haktara. Afagav duchutz mipnim. Even though ultimately, again, the afagav is erased. Chutz mipnim. Yeah, we do learn out haktara of haktara, even though, again, some haktara takes place chutz, and even though some haktara takes place inside. Okay, hold on to this just a moment. We're not finished. Let's finish up one more piece, then we're going to see the halacha l'maisa. Then the Mishnah said, v'kulan shechasru. So remember again, the Mishnah said afterwards, v'kulan shechasru kol shu v'krivu b'chutz pater. That if you have any karban that was set aside in the Beis HaMikdash, any carbonic item, again, in this case, we're dealing with non-animal sacrifices. So again, you have your komes, your lavona, your ktores, your minchas, all of these items. The Mishnah said, if it was deficient, if the carbon was deficient, it was missing some amount of the shear in any way, and you offered it up outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you are pater. You are pater, which again, both say makes sense in accordance with what we were just saying, because the only time there's going to be liability for chutz is when you offer up something in a parallel way that it would have been accepted inside of the Beis HaMikdash. But if it is deficient, then halacha l'maisa, there's not liability for chutz. Okay, now watch this. I'm going to ask an interesting question. Ibaylo, chisaron d'chutz shmei chisaron, or lo shmei chisaron. I will say, watch this case. Let's say just whatever. Let's take the komets, right? Simple case. Kohen went ahead. I'm a Kohen, at least for the next 3 minutes, right? I'm a Kohen. I go ahead and I have the carbon mincha. I take my 3 fingerfuls, I put it aside. I'm ready to burn that on the mizbeach. What happens? For whatever the reason, I end up taking it outside, or someone else ends up taking it outside. So what's halacha? If some of the komets is deficient, ultimately, again, and it's offered up in a mizbeach outside, there's not liability. What happens if the komets, when it was taken outside, had the complete shear, but then it became deficient outside of the Beis HaMikdash? So the deficiency didn't occur inside, the deficiency occurred outside. What's the status of that mincha? So the Gemara says, "Ibaylo chisaron d'chutz shmei chisaron lo shmei chisaron." So kinyaminad kevad dinafak ifsaluhu mali chaser mali yaser. On one hand, you can say like this: look, once you take a chometz outside of the Beis HaMikdash, then what's the status of that chometz? What's the status? It's puzzle. right? Once you remove sacrificial matter from the Beis Hamikdash, it is puzzle. So once you remove that kometz from the Beis Hamikdash, so again, the kometz is puzzle. At that point, who cares if it's the same shear or less than a shear? Ultimately, again, it's puzzle. O Dilma, Yotze Diisa Be'ene in Delese Be'ene Lo. Or maybe not. Maybe the only time that there's liability for offering up sacrificial matter outside of the Beis Hamikdash is when it's fully intact. But if it's not fully intact, i.e., if it's deficient, there will not be liability for offering it up outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll say that's the shaila. So I'm going to Abai says, Tashma, let's analyze this. Rabbi Eliezer, Poter, Achiyakir Veskulan. Rabbi Eliezer, remember again, Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, anytime you take these items outside of the Beis Hamikdash and offer them up, you are only liable if you offer them up in their entirety. In their entirety. Amalei Rabba bar Rav Chanan la'Abaye, mid Rabbi Eliezer, Pashit Mar. I don't understand. You're answering this from Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, Amalei beferish shmiel minei drav ad kan lo pligi Rabbanan le Rabbi Eliezer el di'ise be'ene. Even the Rabbanan are only arguing Rabbi Eliezer when the sacrificial matter is fully intact. Aval b'chisaron modulei. But when the actual sacrificial matter is deficient, even they will agree with Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, Lav de chaser b'chutz. Are we not talking about where the sacrificial matter became deficient outside of the Beis Hamikdash? Lo the chaser bifnim. No, we're talking about ultimately again where it became deficient inside of the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara says, Tashma. So therefore, Rabbi said, we still haven't answered our question. But what happens if you take sacrificial outside of the Beis Hamikdash? When you took it out, when it was inside, it was totally fine. The deficiency occurred outside of the Beis Hamikdash. What's the status of Tashma? V'kulan shechasru v'krivan b'chutz pater. So again, the Mishnah said anything, right? Any carbon that was taken out, kulan shechasru, anything that was deficient and offered up outside, you're going to be pater. Lav the chaser b'chutz. We're not talking about a case where it became deficient outside. To which the Gemara said, lo the chaser b'fnim. No, not necessarily. Rather, we could be talking about a case where it became chaser, became deficient, ultimately again inside of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so therefore I will say, so the Gemara doesn't seem to answer that question. So before we move on over here, I just want to share with you the Rambam because we need to get a handle on exactly this idea. Because on one hand, we're saying that in order for there to be liability, ultimately, again, for offering up karbanos outside of the Beis Hamikdash, that which you are offering up has to, quote unquote, be complete. The shaila is, what is the definition of complete? So listen to this, before we go on, before we finish the last piece. So listen to this. So this is the Rambam, but it's very important, very important. So even if you're not paying attention for the rest of the shir, it's okay. Let's just lean into it, right? Just give me 30 seconds of concentration and attentiveness. Right? You're like, yeah, I can do that, right? Just listen to this. So this is Rambam Hilchos Maseh Karbanos Perek Yutes Halacha Chesen Tes. This is just going to help frame it for us. Kol davar shechayav and halasa kevan shalom mimenu kizayis b'chutz chayv. So first thing. Any time that you are liable for offering up a carbon outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Now again, remember, what are you liable for? Pretty much remember, what are you liable for? Anything that is normally al Pesach or al Moed, anything that is normally brought inside the Beis Hamikdash, if you offer it up outside, you are liable. How much of that item do you have to offer up outside in order to be liable? The Rambam says, kizayis. So again, animal sacrifices, Kitoras, Mincha, Nesachim, whatever it is, if you offer up a kizayis, a sacrificial matter that was supposed to be offered up inside, and you offered it up outside, you are chayiv. Now, remember, why is this important? It could very well be that for the particular carbon, the amount you have to offer up inside of the Beis Hamikdash is more than a kizayis. But the Rambam says the amount for liability b'chutz outside is a kizayis. So that is halacha l'maisa number one. Good, fine. Aval imchisar also davra kared koshu b'fnim sheirusa b'chutz pater. However, the Rambam says now. Okay, before I explain that, let me look at the next case. Kesad. Listen to this. Hakometz o alavona v'aimurin va'ola o mincha nesarfas anasay shchashu mitzasam b'fnim. So let's listen to this. However, the Rambam says like this. If the carbon itself became deficient inside of the Beis Hamikdash, right? So now he quotes, and this is our sugya. So let's say you have kometz, levona, a murin, ola, mincha, whatever it is, animal sacrifice, these non-animal sacrifices, and what happens? Shechasru miktsasam bifnim. They became deficient inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Something happened with the shear in the Beis HaMikdash, became deficient, and then you take some amount of it and offer it up outside, you are pater. So if a carbon becomes deficient inside, and then you offer it up outside, you are pater. Shari ne'emar la'asos oso ala shalim hu chayiv ve'no chayiv ala chaser. You are only chayiv when a carbon is fully intact. If the carbon becomes deficient inside of the Beis HaMikdash, even if you subsequently offer up a kizayis outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you are pater. What about our case? Hotzi shalem v'chaser b'chutz. Let's say when I took out the carbon, it was complete, and then it became deficient outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Harei zeh safek. The Rambam says it's a safek, lefichach eino loka. The Rambam says like this: in order for there to be liability for offering up any carbonic matter outside, the carbon has to be fully intact. But you don't have to offer all of it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. All you need to do is offer up a kizayis of it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. If the carbon becomes deficient inside of the Beis HaMikdash and you offer up part of it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there is not liability. If the carbon is fully intact and it becomes deficient outside of the Beis HaMikdash, is there liability? Safek, and therefore you would not be punished in that particular case. Incredible. Says the Mishnah, mincha shelo nikmitza. So I'm sorry, I skipped. Sorry. Hamakriv kachim. So I'll say, remember again, this is the last case of the Mishnah. Hamakriv kachim ve'imur b'chutz chai. So this is an interesting case. Let's say you offer up a piece of sacrificial meat, and that piece of sacrificial meat has both meat and a murin, sacrificial parts together. Right? So normally they'd be separated, but let's say they're together. They're literally together. In other words, part of the same mass of meat. And you burn them together on the Mizbeach. So what is the halacha? Chayiv. Mishnah says you're chayiv. I asks the Gemara, amai, va'ika chatzitza. Oh, but why should you be chayiv? As Rabbi said, listen to this, it says chatzitza, memanavshach. Again, right, something is not touching your outer Mizbeach. In other words, remember, if it's the side of the imurin that's touching the Mizbeach, that means the meat is not touching the Mizbeach. If the meat is touching the Mizbeach, that means the imurin are not touching the Mizbeach. So how can you say that you would be chayiv? Because remember again, this should not be a proper offering. I was supposed to remember again, there's only liability for chutz when the parallel act would have been an acceptable carbon inside of the Beis HaMikdash. But if you were to do this inside of the Beis HaMikdash, take a mass of meat, right, one piece of meat that has both meat and imurin, and put it on the Mizbeach, bepashtus, it would not be good because some part is not touching the Mizbeach itself, and therefore the other part is a chatzitza, is an interposition between one piece of meat and the altar. Incredible. So which Gemara says, not a problem. Amr Shmuel, so three answers. So Amr Shmuel, Kisha Hafchan, no problem. The answer is where you put it on the side, right? In other words, you put it so that, therefore, in other words, you position the piece of meat so that both pieces are touching the Mizbeach. All right, easy answer. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, afilu teimush lo havchan. So no, even if you don't turn it over. It could reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon. Most remember again, is in the machlokes. In order to be liable for chutz, right? Do you need a mizbeach or don't you need a mizbeach? It could very well be that this is reflecting the view of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says you don't need a mizbeach when you're offering stuff outside. Rather, even if you offer it up on a sela, on a stone, ultimately there's going to be liability. And Rav says, min b'mino eino chotzetz. Rav says that no, min b'mino chotzetz means that halacha l'maisa, when you have similar items do not create an interposition with each other. So therefore, meat is meat, and therefore, even though these two different pieces of meat have two different identities, ultimately, again, min b'mino and chatzitz, two like items do not create the chatzitz. Rabbi said, just give like a good example of this. It's actually just like relevant. Min b'mino and chatzitz is a big discussion. So Rabbi said, let's say when you put on your tefillin, just to give you just like a quick example of this, right? So what happens? So obviously I'm sorry, I'm a lefty, right? The bias is supposed to be situated on your bicep. So let's say again, I'm putting on my tefillin, right? And let's say the ritzua, the strap goes underneath the bias. Right, so that the bias is sitting on the strap. Now, not ideal, but let's say you did it and you realize it afterwards. Do you have to go ahead and put your tefillin back on? The answer is no. Why? Because min b'mino eino chotzetz. In other words, But again, I'm just pointing out that when you have two like items, they do not create the chatzitza. They do not create a chatzitza. As opposed to, let's say, if your yarmulke gets stuck underneath your shalrosh, underneath the bias of the shalrosh, that is a problem, right? Because my yarmulke is something separate than my head, right? So just an interesting idea. So it applies both in meat. It applies in a lot of different areas of halacha. Good. So we'll say, so that's the halacha. Fine. Mishnah. Mincha shlo nikmitza ve'kriva b'chutz patis. Well, it's another interesting case over here. If you have a mincha that the kamitza was not taken from it. So remember again, karban mincha is a meal offering, you take the kamitza. Let's say the mincha was not, the kamitza was not done, ve'kriva b'chutz. You end up offering up this mincha outside of the Beis HaMikdash. What's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, you're pater. Now this makes a lot of sense. Why am I pater? Why am I pater? Because such an offering would not have been acceptable inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Because remember again, the only time you could offer up a mincha inside of the Beis HaMikdash is when after the kamitza has been done. If you haven't taken the kamitza, there's no karban to offer. So therefore, if you take this and you offer it up outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there is no liability for that. Kamsa, v'chazar kumsa, ultimately again, if you do the kamitza, if you take the kamitza, the chazar comes to the socha. So it's an interesting case here. So you take the kamitza, and then the kamitza goes ahead and gets mixed back into the mincha. So what's talacha? V'kriva b'chutz, and you offer it up outside of the Beis HaMikdash, chayiv. So we'll say this is a case where the kamitza was taken, but then somehow the kamitza got mixed back in with the rest of the mincha. So in that case, halacha l'maisa, there is going to be liability. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The Gemara jumps into the case of the kamitza that gets mixed back in. I don't understand. Why should, if the kamitza gets mixed back in, shouldn't the kamitza be batal, right? There's so much more of the rest of the mincha than the kamitza. Shouldn't the kamitza be batal in the rest of the mincha mixture? The Torah uses the lashon of burning by the komets and by the leftovers of the karban mincha. Just like I will say by the burning of the komets, right? One komets ultimately again does not negate another. So too again, when it comes to the shrine, the burning of the leftovers or it comes to the leftovers of the mincha, the leftovers are not mevatel the komets either. All right, so interesting again, based on a limit from the psukim, that even though again when the komets ends up getting mixed back in with the rest of the mincha, the komets will not be batel. Incredible. Mishnah, hakomets va'levona shikriv hashikriv es echa mehem b'chutz. So what says, here we go. Right now, in general, the Gemara is talking about over here as follows. When you have a regular, Rashi says, a minchas nedava, a regular mincha, right? The voluntary mincha. So the halacha is that mincha has two matirin. Remember again, from our pegel days, we're talking about the matirin, the permitters, right? The things that make the karban effective. So a regular mincha stam has two matirin. What are they? Number one, again, the komets, and number two, the accompanying levona. So now in this case over here, what happened? You have komets and levona, shikriv es echad mehem b'chutz. You have komets and levona, and you only offered one of them outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So what's the halacha? Chayiv. There's liability for that. Rabbi Eliezer poter at shiakriv es hashem. Rabbi Eliezer says, so Tanakama essentially says that halacha l'maisa, as long as you have gone ahead and offered up one of the permitters outside, ultimately again you're going to be chayiv. Rabbi Eliezer says no. There's only liability for chutz if you do a proper. In other words, if again, as you keep saying, the only time you're liable for doing something outside is if the parallel act would have been effective inside. So Rabbi Eliezer says the only time there's going to be liability is if you offer up both matirin. Okay, echad b'fnim ve'echad b'chutz. What happens if you offered up, let's say one of them, the komets inside and the levona outside, or vice versa? Chayiv. Ultimately, you're going to be chayiv because in this case, in the end of the day, both permitters were offered. Shnei bazich levona sheikriv echad mehen. Sheikriv es echad mehen b'chutz chayiv. Similarly, again, if you have the two spoons of the levona, you offer one of them inside, one of them outside. You're chayiv. Rabbi Eliezer poter. Can't say machlokes. Well, it says no. There's only going to be liability if you offer up all of the matirin, and therefore there's only liability if you offer up the second one as well. What happens if you offer up one of them inside and one of them outside? ultimately, again, chayiv. There is liability. Incredible. So, by Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha asked the following kasha. Kometz mahu sheyater kinegdo b'shirayim. This is an interesting case. So now that we know that halacha l'maisa, for a carbon mincha, you need two matirin, right? You need both of the kometz as well as the lavona. So what happens if a person goes ahead and offers up the kometz? Do we say that the kometz permits a certain corresponding amount of the mincha or not? So the Gemara says, so ma'u sheyater kinegdo b'shirayim mishra shari o kilushim miklash. Do we say that the offering up of one permitter, let's say, right, the offering up of, let's say, the kometz, does that go ahead and permit part of the mincha, or just generally diminish the isser, right, the severity of the isser associated with the shirayim? Aliba demands, whose opinion are we asking here? Aliba de Rabbi Meir, they're mefaglin bechatzi matir mishashari. So according to Rabbi Meir says in general, you could create pigel with only one matir, which is according to Rabbi Meir, all you need is one matir in order for the carbon to be effective. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, again, so too even the offering of one matir would permit the shirayim. According to the Rabbanon who say that one matir is not enough to create pigel, he holds that one matir is ineffective. If one matir is ineffective, that means it doesn't permit the corresponding part of the mincha, nor does it in any way diminish the severity of the isser. Ella aliba de Rabbi Eliezer. Rather, it was according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds like the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon hold the same way that you can't create pigel with half a matir, so to half a matir will not permit a corresponding amount of mincha either. Ela aliba de Rabbanon the hacha. Rather, Rabbi says it's according to the Rabbanon over here. My mishra shari o kalash miklash. So Rabbi say that's the shayla. According to the Rabbanon over here, when you offer up, remember a mincha has two matirin, the kometz and the lavona. If you offer up one of them, what does that do? Does that permit like 50% of the shirayim, or does it not permit it, but does it somehow downgrade the severity of the isra of consuming it without the other matter or not? To which the Gemara says, Tegu, open-ended question. Okay. Hazorik mixas dam bachos. We'll see another interesting case over here. If a person goes ahead and does a partial blood application outside, so now we're reverting back just for a moment to the offering of animal sacrifices outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Now look what you did over here. Before you turn the page, or if you turn, just go back just for 1 second. Look at the last Rashi on Amud Aleph. Hazorik mitzas damim kigon matana achos va'afilu mechatos hapnimios shakol matanoseim akvos. So we'll say, here's the case. Let's say you have a particular carbon that has multiple blood applications. Right, multiple blood applications. Whether this is what we call a chatas pnimi, we spent a lot of time on this, right? Whether it's like an inner chatas, where all of the blood applications are necessary in order to render the carbon effective, or it's, let's say, an outer chatas, or an outer offering, where all you need is one blood application. Whatever the case is. So you have a carbon that requires multiple blood applications. You did one blood application outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So one blood application b'chutz. So azorek miktas dam b'chutz. Now Amud Beis. So what does the Gemara say? Chayiv. You're chayiv. Look at Rashi, just the top Rashi on Amud Beis. The Rabbanim the low boy kula matir. Rabbi Lazar nami moda b'kitamina b'Gemara. So we'll say, interestingly enough. Now, again, according to the Rabbanan, this makes a lot of sense. Because according to the Rabbanan say, in general, in order to be chayiv for offering something up b'chutz, you don't have to do all of the matirin. You don't have to do all the permitters. The chiddush over is going to be, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that normally there's only liability if you do a complete service, all the matirin, even he would agree that one blood application ultimately, again, generates liability. Gemara's Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, even Rabbi say again on Sukkot, remember again on Sukkot, there's a very unique offering of Nisa Chamayim called the water libation. Rabbi Eliezer says, even if you go ahead and on Sukkot, you offer up, you do Nisa Chamayim, you do the water libation outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you are chayiv. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, Shiare Hadam Shekrivo B'chutz chayiv. Rabbi Nechemia says ultimately again that if you have leftover blood, right? Now I will say, now remember, this is also a little chazara. Shiare Hadam, what is that referring to? Shiare Hadam is also, remember again, after you do the zrika, after you do the blood sprinklings, there's all the leftover blood. So watch this. Rabbi Nechemia says, Shiare Hadam shekrivu b'chutz chayiv. Wow, that's big. Rabbi Nechemia says, if you take the shirayim, the leftover blood after the zrika is done, and you take that blood and you apply it on a mizbeach outside of the Beis HaMikdash, then what's talacha? You're chayiv. Now that's wild. What does that tell you? That's not so wild. Why? Because remember again, Rabbi Nechemia is the opinion who holds shirayim ma'akvim. What is in shirayim ma'akvim? Rabbi Nechemia, remember again, Rabbi Nechemia holds, we have this machlokes about is there an obligation to go ahead and pour out the blood, pour out the remaining blood on the yesod, right, at the base of the mizbeach or not? Is that ma'akev? Is that not ma'akev? Rabbi Nechemia holds it is ma'akev. So because it is ma'akev, because it is a necessary part, therefore, if you take this shirayim and you pour it out b'chutz, ultimately, again, there's going to be liability for that. Say, Rabbi Osai, let's just to summarize, a lot of halachas in this Mishnah. Halacha number one, if you do even one blood application from multiple blood applications outside, ultimately, again, there's going to be liability. That's number one. Number two, Rabbi Eliezer, if you do Nisa Chamayim, if you do the water libation on Sukkot and you do that outside, ultimately, liability. And number three, Rabbi Nechemia, if you take the shirayim, the leftover blood, that's after the zrika has been done. So zrika has been done inside of the Beis HaMikdash. You take the leftover blood and you apply it outside, you pour it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately, again, liability. Liability. Says the Gemara. Amar Rava says as follows, Umoda Rabbi Eliezer b'damim. Rava says like this, Rabbi Eliezer agrees ultimately again in the case of damim. Rabbi Eliezer agrees, now remember, what's interesting about this? So up until now, there's been this ongoing machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Eliezer says that in order for there to be liability for chutz, you have to do a complete service. Yet here in our Mishnah, everyone is agreeing that when it comes to blood applications, even if you just do one blood application outside, there is liability. Even Rabbi Eliezer agrees with that. So what's up with that? So Rabbi Eliezer b'damim, the Sanya, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon Omrim, mimakom shepasa kumaschia. So I say, interestingly enough, this is by Yom Kippur, and this is interestingly enough, if in the middle of going ahead and doing the avodah of Yom Kippur, let's say the blood of one of the chatas offerings spills, ultimately, again, even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that they shecht a new animal and they don't have to start from the beginning. Don't start from the beginning. Rather, you just pick up from wherever you left off in the Yom Kippur service, which tells you that even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that when it comes to blood service, when it comes to any type of zrika, partial zrika is effective. And therefore, so by Yom Kippur, if you started the zrika, then the blood spilled, you have to shecht a new animal, but you don't have to start the zrika service again. Rather, just pick up wherever you left off. Why? Because partial zrika is effective zrika. So too, if you do one active zrika outside of the Beis HaMikdash, even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that that is going to be effective. Incredible. So both I say, interestingly enough, as much as this machlokes beforehand, when it comes to blood applications, both the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer will agree that one blood application outside of the Beis HaMikdash generates chutz liability. Incredible. The Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Afa Menasech Niachag B'chutz. So again, Rabbi Eliezer says that even if you go ahead and you offer up water libations, right, on Sukkot, outside of the basement, the Shechayev, Amr Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Nachum Yutfa. So Rabbi Yochanan said the name of Rabbi Nachum Yutfa. Rabbi Eliezer b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabo Amra. So listen to this. Rabbi Eliezer is obviously holding according to Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe. Now, what did Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe say? The Amar Niso Chamayim Deoraisa. Okay, so we'll say now. Watch this. Rabbi Akiva holds that the water libation of Sukkot ultimately again is midoraisa. Right, is a biblical obligation. I will say so again. Let's take a step back over here. Rabbi Eliezer said in the Mishnah that if you do the water libation of Sukkot outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you are liable. Now again, so therefore comes along Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says of Rabbi Nachum Yitfa that Rabbi Eliezer clearly holds that the water libation service, the Nisuch HaMayim, is D'oraisa. Because obviously, if it wasn't D'oraisa, you wouldn't be liable for doing it outside. I, who hold that Nisuch HaMayim is D'oraisa, he must hold like Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe. Because Rabbi Akiva holds that Nisuch HaMayim is D'oraisa. The Sanya, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Unisacheha. The pasuk says again, and its libations. B'shnei nisuchim hakosav medaber. Torah is talking about two different types of libations. Echad nisoch hamayim ve'echad nisoch hayayin. One is a water libation and one is a wine libation. So what do you see from here? Ultimately, again, that there are two different types. So Rabbi Akiva says, you see from here that the water libation is a de'oraisa, two different types of libations. If that's the case, if that's the case, then the same way, again, if we're kind of learning out water libations and wine libations from the same place, then we should say, the same way that wine libations have to be 3 lugin, so too the water libations should also be 3 lugin. Rabbi Lazar, mehacha kamar. But here's the issue. Rabbi Lazar doesn't give a shear, right? He doesn't say if you offer up 3 lugin outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Instead, what does he say? If you offer up of the waters of the Nisoch HaMayim on Sukkos, which makes it sound like any amount there's going to be a liability for. Furthermore, again, wine libations are given throughout the year. So we should say the same way that there's liability for wine libations throughout the year, there should be liability for water libations throughout the year as well. Rabbi Lazar b'chag ka'amar, and Rabbi Lazar ultimately again said dafka on Sukkos, to which the Gemara says, you're right. Ishtamite had amar Rabasi. In reality, Rabbi Yochanan forgot about that which Rav Asi said. Am Rav Asi, Am Rabbi Yochanan Shavei Nechunya, Ish Bakas Beis Charson. Rabbi Asi said name Rabbi Yochanan, right? He said name Rabbi Nechunya. He said name Nechunya, Ish Bakas Beis Charson. Listen to this. Eser Netios, Arava V'Nisoch Hamayim Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. The Rabbi say ultimately again. No. There is a much bigger limud over here. That where do we learn out Nisoch Hamayim? Because I just want to point out, it's actually interesting. The concept of the water libation, which was a very important sacrificial rite over the course of the Yom Tov of Sukkos, is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah, which is very strange. That's why, so just so you understand what's happening over here, the Gemara is like a little bit intrigued that Rabbi Lazar said that if you offer up the water libation on Sukkos outside of the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately you're liable. The Gemara is like, interesting. So I guess Rabbi Lazar holds that offering is d'oraisa, but yet that offering is not mentioned in the Torah at all. So how do you know? The Gemara says, no problem. Rabbi Lazar learns out from his Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva says that when the Torah speaks about libations, it says libations in the plural. Nisacha, which teaches us that there's 2 different types of libations, wine libations and water libations. What's the problem with that? If we're learning out water libations from the same source as wine libations, then that means water has to be like wine. In which case, the same way that wine is 3 lugin, water has to be 3 lugin. But the problem is Rabbi Elazar in the Mishnah makes it sound like if you offer up any amount of water on Sukkos outside of Beis, you're going to be chayiv. That's issue number 1. Number 2, if you're learning out wine from water, then we should say the same way that wine libations apply every day, water libations apply every day. To which the Gemara says, therefore, it can't be that Rabbi Akiva is the source for Nisoch Hamayim. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Rabbi Akiva is not the source for Nisoch Hamayim. There's another source for Nisoch Hamayim. What's the source? It's the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. It's one of these Sinaitic laws that ultimately, again, Moshe Rabbeinu received at Har Sinai. Now, again, remember, Halacha L'Moshe Misinai says that it is a d'oraisa, even though what? It is not written in the Torah. There are multiple examples of this, but one of these, so therefore the Gemara says over here, 3 examples of this. Eser Netios. Now, both say Eser Netios is, without getting into the intricacies of this, literally means 10 saplings. If you have 10 saplings planted in an area of base Sa'ah, you are allowed to farm that area up until the Shemitah year. Normally, the halacha is that certain restrictions of Shemitah really begin to kick in even 30 days before the beginning of the Shemitah year. But there's a special halacha that says that if you have 10 saplings planted in an area of base Sa'ah, that area needs to be tended to, and if it's not, you're going to suffer an irretrievable loss. Therefore, you're allowed to farm it up until the beginning of Shemitah itself. Okay, that's the law of Eser Netios. Arava. The law of Arava, Rabbi say, is that we circle the Mizbeach with the Arava on Sukkos. Again, that practice is not mentioned in the Torah, but is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And lastly, Nisoch Hamayim. Lastly, again, is the law of Nisoch Hamayim. Again, the idea that on Sukkos, we have a water libation, we pour water on the Mizbeach. Ultimately, again, that is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai as well. So therefore, Rabbi said, so to bring this full circle, that's why, again, Rabbi Lazar says in the Mishnah that halacha l'maaseh, if you go ahead and you do a water libation on Sukkot outside of the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately you're going to be liable. What's the source that Nisuch HaMayim is da'araisa? Ultimately, again, it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And again, Rabbi Akiva's drasha is still a good one. Nisachah tells us ultimately again that yes, there are different types of libations, wine libations, water libations, but that's not the makar. That's not the source for Nisuch HaMayim. The source for Nisuch HaMayim ultimately again is going to be a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Therefore, it's a da'araisa, and that's Rabbi Elazar says in the Mishnah that indeed, if you do a water libation outside of the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately, again, you will be liable only if you do so on the Yom Tov of Sukkot. Because remember, again, if you pour water on the Mizbeach the rest of the year, what is that? What is that? Strange, right? That's what it is, right? It's nothing. Like in other words, like, what are you doing, right? In other words, it's nothing. It's nothing. That's not sacrificial nature. Only on the Yom Tov of Sukkot itself. Okay, I'll say wonderful. Stop over here for today. Shkoyach. What a daf. What a daf. Just share with you a short idea from the parsha. So I'll say, so one of the most riveting parts, there's so many riveting parts of the parsha. One of the most beautiful things that resonates with us a lot is, of course, this is the parsha. Yaakov Avinu goes ahead and benches his grandsons, Menashe and Ephraim, who later on then become Ephraim and Menashe. And again, this is the source. This develops into the practice that many of us follow, each and every Shabbos. Yisimcha Elokim ki Ephraim Menashe, as you bless a person is privileged to have children, you bless your children. Yisimcha Elohim ki Ephraim Menashe. Kadosh Baruch Hu should make you like Menashe and Ephraim, like Ephraim and Menashe. So I want to point out something interesting. There's a lot of Torah that in general, like, why are we blessing our sons to be like Ephraim and Menashe, right? It's not like we know that much about Ephraim and Menashe, right? They were born in Egypt. So again, I want to draw that's usually where the bulk of our attention goes to. I actually want to draw your attention a little bit earlier in the pasuk, because the pasuk I'm quoting is Parak Memches, pasuk Chav, chapter 48, verse 20. So listen to how beautiful this is. The pasuk says, Vayivarechim bayom ahu leimar, Yaakov Avinu blessed them on that day, saying, B'cha yivarech Yisrael leimar. Through you or with you, Yisrael will bless their children, saying, Yisimcha Elohim ke Ephraim Menashe. That ultimately, again, right, Hashem Shemekul Ephraim Menashe, Vayasem as Ephraim Lifnei Menashe. And again, he put Ephraim before Menashe. So both sides, Ramosha Leib of Sasov Rebbe says something so incredibly beautiful. He says, the profundity of the bracha is much earlier in the pasuk. He isolates the phrase, Vayivarchem bayom hahu leimor. What was the bracha? What's the bracha? The beauty in Chassidus, is you have to have a little bit of imagination and know where to put punctuation. Because sometimes a phrase punctuate a little bit differently opens up a whole new world of opportunities. So we read the phrase, Vayivarchim bayom hahu leimar. Ultimately, again, he blessed them on that day. Rav Moshe Vasas, the Rebbe says, no, that's not how to read the pasuk. It's Vayivarchem kama. Yaakov Avinu blessed his children. And what was the blessing? The blessing was Bayom Hahu. The bracha is, have enough wisdom to focus on maximizing the day right in front of you. Make every day Bayom Hahu. This is the day. So often in life, we get focused on future planning, right? We're future oriented. What's my plan? What am I accomplishing in life? What's my 1-year plan, my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan, my 1-week plan? And that's all important. That's incredibly important. But sometimes we become so fixated on the future that we forget to maximize the present. And we forget that ever important lesson, which is you can plan as much as you want for the future. But there's one really important piece of information to go ahead and always remember, which is you don't control that future. You have no idea what curveballs life is going to throw you, and there are usually many that come our way. So do I have to have a future plan? Absolutely. Can I become totally focused on my future? That doesn't make any sense because I don't control it. But there is one thing that you absolutely do control, which is how you're going to live the day right in front of you. The one thing you really only control is the day that is in front of you. And the bracha says Rav Moshe Levasasav that Yaakov Avinu gave his children Vayivarechem. What's the ultimate bracha? Bayom hahu. Maximize your day. Both say, when that alarm goes off in the morning, and for many of us, That is the most dreaded sound, right, in the entire universe, right? When that alarm goes up, like, no, not yet, not yet. So I'll say, our avoda in life is to turn that into the sweetest sound of the day. Because when that alarm goes off, that's the sound, in other words, somebody has to create a Bayomahu ringtone. Right? Somebody has to do this, right? Adam Steinmetz created a different ringtone. I forgot. Good morning. I think a good morning ringtone. Right? Somebody said there is a Bayomahu ringtone that is out there waiting to be created. Can you imagine an alarm goes off and it says Bayoma in a sweet voice, a melodic voice, right? Right? And if you put an accent to it, it sounds even nicer and more melodic. Bayomahu, 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 Bayomahu. It's your day. It's your day. It's your day. You control it. What do you want to make of tomorrow? You don't control. Next week, you don't control. Next year, for sure, you have no idea what it's going to bring. But Bayomahu, today, you absolutely listen to the word. Let me read to you in the words of the Rebbe. He says, Beirach Osam. He blessed them. Sheyivakshu v'yispalalu rak al tzarchei hayom hahu. The Rebbe says Yaakov Avinu blessed his children and his grandchildren that they should only be preoccupied and focused on today. V'lo yidagu da'agas machar. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about tomorrow. Because preoccupation with tomorrow ultimately again leads you to squander the profundity and the power of the day in front of you. Sometimes the greatest bracha we can have in life is to have the wisdom, to have the strength, and to have the fortitude to maximize Bayomahu, the day that is right here in front of us. I know it may sound like a strange lesson to learn on a Friday, the end of the week. But sometimes they're both saying the best lessons you learn on a Friday. You learn on Erev Shabbos, because then I learn them, I let them seep in, I kind of let them ruminate and stew a little bit over Shabbos Kodesh, and then by the time I make Havdalah Matzeh Shabbos, I'm like, I got this. I got this. I'm ready to become a Bayom Hahu Jew. A Jew doesn't procrastinate. A Jew doesn't get caught up in all the ideas and all the worries about tomorrow, next week, this. Yes, I have to be a forward-thinking individual. And of course I have to plan. But the ultimate bracha that Yaakov Avinu gives to, the ultimate bracha that he gives to his children, he gives to us, and the ultimate actualization of bracha in life is to become Bayomahu Jews, the kind of people who focus on today, maximize today, and make the most of our Bayomahu. A good Shabbos, everyone. What a week. Incredible.